Careful what you call someone. You might be revealing more about yourself than them. The crystal glasses chimed softly under the warm golden lights of Whitmore House, a private dining room reserved for people who never had to ask the price of anything, where a single bottle of wine cost more than a month's rent in most parts of the country, and where silence usually meant power, not discomfort, until that night, when a single sentence would fracture the illusion of control. Emily Carter stood at the edge of the table, not quite part of the room, yet impossible to ignore. Her black uniform pressed, her posture straight, her presence quiet, almost invisible, the kind of presence people overlooked until they needed something. Her notepad resting lightly in her hand, her pen moving with small, precise strokes that didn't quite look like ordinary writing. Daniel Whitmore noticed it first, not the woman herself, but the way she wrote, efficient, deliberate, almost coded. He leaned back slightly in his chair, his $30,000 watch catching the light as his eyes narrowed just a fraction, curious, calculating, but not yet interested enough to speak. Across from him, Victoria Whitmore swirled her wine slowly, her expression composed, her smile sharp enough to cut through the soft jazz drifting in the background. She had mastered the art of elegance without warmth, control without effort, and tonight, she was bored, and boredom, for someone like Victoria, always needed an outlet. She glanced up, her eyes landing on Emily, lingering just long enough to turn attention into discomfort. "You're new," she said, her voice smooth, almost pleasant, but something underneath it shifted the air. Emily looked up, meeting her gaze for exactly 1 second, then nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Her voice calm, steady, neither submissive nor challenging, just present. Victoria tilted her head slightly, studying her, as if trying to place something that didn't belong, or perhaps something that refused to perform the way it was expected to. "Then let's see how well you keep up," she continued, sliding a leather folder across the table. Inside it, not a menu, but a dense document, printed in tight, formal text, the kind of contract most people in the room wouldn't bother reading themselves. "Read this," she said lightly, as if it were a harmless request, as if the room hadn't just shifted its focus entirely onto one woman standing in a server's uniform. A few guests exchanged amused glances. One man chuckled under his breath, already anticipating the outcome. Emily didn't move right away, her fingers resting gently on the edge of the folder, her eyes scanning the first few lines in silence. The room waited, the way people wait for entertainment, for embarrassment, for confirmation of what they already believed. Victoria leaned back, crossing her legs, satisfied. "Or should I assume that's a bit beyond your skill set?" she added, her tone softer now, almost pitying, and that was the moment the room tipped, not loudly, not dramatically, just a subtle shift, like the air before a storm no one else could feel yet. Emily closed the folder gently, not abruptly, not defensively, just with intention. She looked up again, this time holding Victoria's gaze a second longer, her expression unchanged, her voice quiet, almost careful. "Are you sure you'd like me to read this out loud?" A pause followed, brief but noticeable. Victoria smiled, slow and deliberate. "Please," she said, gesturing lightly with her glass. "Enlighten us." A few more quiet laughs, a clink of silverware. Someone leaned forward in their seat. Daniel didn't laugh. He didn't speak. But his eyes didn't leave Emily now, not for a second, because something in her tone hadn't matched the moment. It hadn't matched the role she was supposed to play. And for the first time that evening, the most powerful man in the room wasn't watching his wife. He was watching the waitress, and the room, without realizing it, had already begun to listen. Emily Carter did not rush. She did not glance around for approval. She simply reached for the leather folder again and opened it with the same quiet precision she had shown all evening, her fingers steady, her posture unchanged, as if the weight of a room full of millionaires did not exist, as if she had stood in rooms like this before and learned that noise never meant power. Her eyes moved across the page once, slowly, deliberately, not skimming, not hesitating, just reading, truly reading. And then she began, her voice soft but clear, carrying just enough to reach every corner of the room without ever rising above its natural tone. She did not stumble. She did not pause. She read the opening clause fluently, her pronunciation precise, her cadence controlled, and within seconds, the faint smiles around the table began to fade. The man who had chuckled earlier shifted slightly in his chair, his expression tightening. Victoria's glass stopped midair for just a fraction of a second before she resumed the motion, slower now, more measured. Emily continued, not just reading, but articulating, emphasizing the legal phrasing with a subtle clarity that suggested understanding rather than memorization. She turned the page, not for show, not for effect, but because she had already reached the end of the first section. Daniel leaned forward now, his attention fully locked, his earlier curiosity replaced by something sharper, something more alert. And then Emily stopped, not abruptly, not uncertainly, but with intention, her finger resting lightly on a single line near the middle of the document. The silence that followed was different from before. It was no longer expectant. It was aware. "There is a discrepancy here," she said quietly, her eyes still on the page. Not looking at Victoria, not seeking permission, just stating a fact. A few brows furrowed. Someone exhaled softly, unsure whether to laugh or listen. Victoria lowered her glass slowly, placing it on the table with controlled grace. "I beg your pardon," she said, her tone still polished, but the edge beneath it had sharpened. Emily lifted her gaze then, calm, steady, unshaken. "Section 3, subsection B," she continued, tapping the page lightly. "The sourcing clause contradicts the certification requirement listed in Section 5. A pause, not for drama, but for clarity. If this document is executed as written, it could invalidate the supplier agreement under international standards." The words settled into the room like weight, not loud, not aggressive, just undeniable. The man who had laughed earlier leaned forward now, squinting slightly as if trying to see what she saw. Another guest reached subtly for the folder closest to him, flipping it open, scanning quickly. Daniel stood up halfway from his chair before catching himself, his hand resting on the edge of the table, his eyes moving rapidly across his own copy, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. Victoria did not move, not immediately. Her expression remained composed, but something behind her eyes flickered, something small, something that had not been there before, uncertainty. Emily did not press. She did not elaborate. She simply closed the folder gently once more and placed it back on the table, her hands returning to rest. Lightly in front of her, her voice even softer now, almost reflective. "Most people would read the words," she said, "but not the structure." The room did not react with laughter this time. No one reached for their glass. No one made a comment. The soft music in the background suddenly felt louder than before, and Daniel Whitmore, for the first time that evening, looked at his wife not as the center of the room, but as someone who might have just lost control of it. No one spoke for a full 3 seconds, and in a room where conversations usually overlapped and laughter filled every pause, those 3 seconds felt longer than anything that had come before. Daniel Whitmore slowly lowered himself back into his chair, but did not break his focus, his fingers sliding the document closer as his eyes moved quickly, deliberately, tracing the exact section Emily had pointed out. The air had shifted again, not with tension this time, but with recognition, the kind that arrives quietly and stays. One of the guests cleared his throat, flipping his own copy open with less confidence now, his earlier amusement gone, replaced by concentration. Victoria Whitmore remained still, her posture perfect, her chin slightly lifted, but the rhythm of her breathing had changed, subtle, almost imperceptible, yet present. She reached for the document at last, her movements controlled, precise, as if nothing had happened, as if she were simply verifying a minor detail. But her eyes moved faster than before, scanning, searching, and when she reached subsection B, her fingers paused, just for a fraction of a second, long enough for Daniel to notice. He did not say anything. He did not need to. His silence carried more weight than any interruption could have. Emily stood where she was, not retreating, not advancing, her presence steady, her gaze neutral. She was not watching Victoria now. She was watching the table. The way people reacted when certainty began to crack, the way confidence softened when it met something it could not dismiss. Daniel exhaled slowly, placing the document flat against the table. "She is right," he said, his voice calm, measured, but unmistakable. The words landed with quiet authority, Not loud, not dramatic, just final. A man to his left leaned back, rubbing his jaw as if recalculating something internally. Another guest closed his folder completely, no longer pretending to understand. Victoria lifted her eyes from the page, meeting Daniel's gaze for a brief moment. Something unspoken passing between them. Not anger, not yet, but awareness. And then she looked at Emily. Really looked this time. Not as a server, not as background, but as a variable she had failed to account for. That clause was reviewed by 3 firms, she said, her tone even, but tighter now, less effortless. Emily nodded once, respectful, but not yielding. Yes, ma'am, she replied softly. And they likely read it exactly as it was written. A slight pause, just enough to let the meaning settle. Not as it functions. The distinction hung in the air, subtle, precise, difficult to argue with. Daniel's lips pressed together briefly, not in frustration, but in thought. He tapped the edge of the table once. A habit, a signal, the kind that usually preceded decisions worth millions of dollars. But this time, he did not speak immediately. Instead, he looked back at Emily, studying her. With a level of attention he reserved for negotiations, for risks, for opportunities. Where did you learn to read contracts like that? He asked finally, his tone neutral, but direct. The room shifted again, curiosity replacing tension. Emily did not answer right away, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of her notepad. The same small, deliberate movement she had made earlier. From people who assumed I would not understand them, she said quietly, her voice carrying just enough to reach him. And for the first time that evening, a different kind of silence filled the room, not forced, not uncomfortable, but earned, the kind that follows when someone says exactly what needed to be said, and nothing more. Daniel did not look away, not after her answer, not after the quiet weight of it settled into the room. He leaned back slightly, but his posture had changed, less relaxed now, more deliberate, as if every detail in front of him had suddenly become relevant. People who assumed you would not understand them. He repeated, not as a question, but as something he was testing for truth. Emily gave a small nod. Nothing more, her expression calm, unreadable. She did not expand. She did not defend. She simply let the words stand on their own, and that restraint did more than any explanation could have. One of the men at the far end of the table shifted in his seat, glancing between Daniel and Victoria as if waiting for the moment the balance would tip back. But it did not come. Victoria's fingers rested lightly on the edge of the document, her nails perfectly polished, her posture still elegant, but the confidence that had filled her earlier tone had thinned, not gone, just measured now. She closed the folder slowly, aligning it with the edge of the table with precise control. You have an interesting perspective, she said, her voice smooth again, but quieter, less performative. Emily inclined her head slightly. Thank you, ma'am, she replied, her tone respectful, but unchanged. Daniel's gaze shifted briefly to the notepad in Emily's hand, the small, unfamiliar marking she had been using all evening. That is not standard shorthand, he said, more observation than accusation. Emily glanced down at it, then back at him. No, sir, she answered simply. A pause followed, not empty, but full of unspoken questions. Daniel tapped the table once more, softer this time. It is efficient, he added, and though the words were neutral, the acknowledgement behind them was not. A subtle shift passed through the guests, the kind that happens when someone powerful redirects attention, not with force, but with recognition. One woman reached for her glass, but did not drink, her eyes fixed on Emily now, curious, recalibrating. Victoria watched this quietly, her gaze moving from Daniel to Emily and back again, calculating, adjusting. And for the first time that evening, she did not speak immediately. She allowed the silence to exist, allowed the room to settle around something she had not created. Emily remained still, her presence unchanged, not seeking the moment, not holding on to it, just standing within it. Daniel reached for the document again, flipping it open with a slower, more careful motion than before, his eyes scanning not for confirmation now, but for understanding. If this had gone through as written, he said, almost to himself, it would have cost us more than the deal itself. The realization was quiet, but it carried. A man beside him nodded slightly. Now fully aware of what had almost happened, Victoria's expression did not break, but something in her posture shifted, subtle, controlled, as if she had just recalculated the room and found herself no longer at its center. Emily spoke again, softly, not interrupting, but completing the thought. Mistakes like that are rarely about what is written, she said, her voice steady. They are about what no one expects to be questioned. The words landed differently this time, not as correction, not as defense, but as something closer to truth. Daniel closed the folder once more, but this time, he did not set it aside casually. He placed it down with intention, his hand resting on it for a brief moment before he looked up at her again, not as a server, not as a curiosity, but as someone who had just changed the outcome of a room without raising her voice. And in that moment, the hierarchy everyone had walked in with no longer felt as certain as it had just minutes before. No one returned to their food. Not yet. The plates remained untouched, the wine glasses still, as if the room itself had decided that whatever had just happened mattered more than anything that had been planned for the evening. Daniel Whitmore shifted slightly in his chair, his hand finally moving away from the document. But his attention did not follow. It stayed with Emily, steady, deliberate, measuring something that was no longer simple curiosity. "What is your name?" he asked, the question direct, but without the sharpness it might have carried earlier. Emily met his gaze, just long enough to answer. "Emily Carter, sir." Her voice even, composed, neither eager nor hesitant, just present. Daniel nodded once, as if committing it to memory, not out of politeness, but intention. "Emily," he repeated quietly, and something about the way he said it shifted the room again. Not loudly, not dramatically, but enough. Victoria noticed it. Of course she did. Her eyes flickered toward Daniel, then back to Emily, her posture still controlled, but her presence no longer leading the conversation. "It seems you have been underestimated," Victoria said after a moment, her tone smooth, almost reflective. But there was something different now, something less certain beneath the surface. Emily did not react immediately. She let the words settle, not rejecting them, not accepting them, simply allowing them to exist. "It happens," she said softly, and that was all. No defense, no correction, just truth. One of the guests let out a quiet breath, the kind people release when tension shifts into something else, something harder to define. Daniel leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table. "You understand that document better than some of the people who reviewed it," he said, not as a compliment, but as a fact. Emily's fingers brushed lightly against her notepad again, the same small, controlled motion. "Understanding does not always come from position," she replied, her tone steady. "Sometimes it comes from having to pay attention when others do not." The words landed with weight, not heavy, but precise. Victoria's lips pressed together briefly, not in anger, but in thought. She reached for her glass again, lifting it slowly. But this time, she did not drink. She simply held it, as if buying time, as if recalibrating. Daniel glanced at the document once more, then back at Emily. "If you were in that room when this was drafted," he said, his voice quieter now, more focused, "what would you have done differently?" The question shifted the atmosphere again. No longer about proving, no longer about correcting, but about possibility. Emily paused, not out of uncertainty, but consideration. Her eyes moved briefly to the page, then back to him. "I would have asked one question," she said, her voice calm, almost understated. Daniel waited. The room followed. "Who benefits if this is not noticed?" she finished, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was sharp, clarifying, the kind that forces people to see beyond what is written. Daniel's expression changed. Not dramatically, but enough. A realization settling in, not just about the document, but about the way it had been approached, the assumptions that had been made, the oversight that had almost been ignored. Victoria lowered her glass slowly, placing it back on the table with care, her gaze fixed on Emily now, no longer dismissive, no longer amused, but something else entirely, something closer to respect, though she did not say it. Not yet. Emily remained where she was, her posture unchanged, her presence steady. She had not stepped forward, she had not raised her voice, but somehow, without asking for it, she had shifted the weight of the room, and everyone felt it. Even if no one was ready to name it, Daniel did not respond immediately. Not after her question settled into the room. He leaned back slowly, his eyes drifting not to Emily this time, but to the people around the table, as if seeing them through a different lens, as if recalculating not just the document, but the process that had allowed it to reach this point. One of the senior partners shifted uncomfortably, adjusting his cufflinks, avoiding direct eye contact. Another cleared his throat quietly, flipping the document closed, as if that alone could undo what had just been revealed. The silence stretched, not awkward, but revealing, the kind that exposes what people choose not to say. Victoria watched all of this carefully, her gaze moving from face to face, measuring reactions, noting who spoke and who did not. And then finally, she turned back to Emily, her expression no longer sharpened by amusement, but steadied by something more deliberate. "That is a dangerous question," she said, her voice lower now, more controlled. Emily met her gaze, calm as before. "Only if no one is asking it," she replied. And the simplicity of the answer carried more weight than anything complex could have. Daniel exhaled slowly, a quiet sound, almost thoughtful. He tapped the table once again, softer this time. "We approved this too quickly," he said, not assigning blame, not raising his voice, just stating what had become obvious. One of the men nodded, reluctantly. "The review process assumed alignment," he added, as if trying to recover some sense of control. Daniel glanced at him briefly, then back at the document. "Assumptions are expensive," he said, and this time, there was no disagreement. Victoria's fingers rested lightly against the stem of her glass, but she did not lift it. She was watching Emily again, but not as before, not with dismissal, not with casual authority, but with focus, as if trying to understand how someone standing in a server's uniform had just redirected the course of a conversation meant for executives. "You said you learned from people who underestimated you," Victoria said after a moment, her tone measured, no longer performing for the room. "What did they miss?" The question was quieter than before, but more direct. Emily did not hesitate. Her voice remained steady. "They thought I was listening to respond," she said. "But I was listening to understand." The distinction settled in the air, subtle, but sharp. Daniel's eyes flickered slightly, recognition passing through them, not just of her words, but of the difference they described, a difference that separated reaction from insight. One of the guests leaned back, folding his hands, no longer trying to speak, no longer trying to guide the conversation. The room had shifted too far for that. Emily stood as she had from the beginning, composed, grounded, her presence unchanged by the attention now resting on her. She had not stepped into the spotlight. The spotlight had simply found her, and she did not move to claim it. Victoria studied her for another second. Then slowly, deliberately, she set her glass down, not as a pause, but as a decision. "Bring us a revised copy of this agreement tomorrow," she said, her voice clear, controlled, but no longer dismissive. "With your corrections included." The words landed quietly, but their meaning was unmistakable, a request, not a command. And for the first time that evening, the direction of authority had shifted without anyone raising their voice. Emily inclined her head slightly. "Yes, ma'am," she said, her tone unchanged, respectful, steady. But there was something else now, not pride, not victory, just quiet acknowledgement. And Daniel Whitmore, watching her, understood something he had not expected to learn that night. That power did not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it stood still, spoke softly, and changed everything without asking for permission. Emily did not move right away after Victoria's request, not because she hesitated, but because she understood the weight of what had just been said. Not a command, not a test, but an acknowledgement, quiet and deliberate. She gave a small nod, the kind that carried acceptance without performance. And then she stepped back slightly from the table, her presence softening again, not disappearing, but returning to the space she had originally occupied, the space people had overlooked just minutes ago. And yet now, no one truly looked away. Daniel followed her movement with his eyes, not out of habit, but intent, as if trying to understand how someone could shift a room so completely without ever stepping forward. One of the guests finally reached for his glass, taking a slow sip. the tension easing into something else, something closer to reflection. Another man leaned toward his colleague, whispering quietly, not with amusement, but with curiosity. The tone of the room had changed, not loud, not chaotic, but different in a way that could not be undone. Victoria adjusted her posture slightly, her shoulders relaxing just enough to signal a shift, not surrender, but recalibration. She glanced at Daniel briefly, then back at the table, and for a moment, she said nothing, allowing the silence to breathe, allowing the room to settle into its new balance. Daniel tapped his fingers lightly against the table, a slower rhythm now, more thoughtful than before. "We need to revisit the entire review process," he said finally, his voice calm, but carrying the kind of statement that redirected attention without demanding it. Heads nodded around the table, not out of obligation, but agreement, the earlier confidence replaced by something more cautious, more aware. Emily had reached the edge of the room now, her notepad still in her hand, her posture unchanged. She paused briefly as another server passed behind her, exchanging a quiet glance, the kind of unspoken communication that existed between people who worked in silence while others spoke loudly. And then she turned slightly, ready to continue her shift, to return to the rhythm of orders and refills and small interactions that usually went unnoticed. But Daniel spoke again before she could take another step. "Emily," he said, and this time, his voice carried something different, not authority, not curiosity, but recognition. She turned back, meeting his gaze. "Yes, sir," she replied, steady as before. Daniel held her attention for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully, something he did not often need to do. "Tomorrow," he said, "do not just correct it." A brief pause, not for effect, but clarity. "Rewrite it." The room shifted again, subtle, but undeniable. This was no longer about pointing out a mistake. It was about trust, about responsibility, about inviting someone into a space they had not been given before. Emily considered his words for a second, not surprised, not overwhelmed, just present, and then she nodded once. "Understood," she said, her voice calm, her expression unchanged, but there was something in the way she held his gaze, not defiant, not submissive, simply equal in that moment. Victoria watched this exchange closely, her eyes narrowing just slightly, not in disapproval, but in focus. She understood what had just happened, even if she did not say it aloud. The balance of influence in the room had shifted again, not taken, not forced, but given, and that made it harder to challenge. Emily turned once more, this time continuing her step away from the table, her figure blending back into the quiet movement of the restaurant. But the room did not return to what it had been, not fully, because even as conversations slowly resumed and glasses were lifted again, there was a new awareness in every glance, every pause, every word spoken a little more carefully than before. And at the center of it all was not the woman who had tried to control the room, but the one who had never needed to. The room slowly found its rhythm again, but it was not the same rhythm it had before. Conversations resumed in lower tones, laughter returned in smaller bursts, and every now and then, someone would glance toward the far end of the room where Emily moved quietly between tables, as if confirming that what had just happened had been real. Daniel Whitmore remained still for a moment longer, his attention no longer on the document, nor on the guests, but on the subtle shift that had settled into the space, the kind of shift that did not announce itself yet changed everything. He reached for his glass at last, taking a slow sip, his eyes thoughtful, not distracted, but recalibrating. Across from him, Victoria adjusted the fold of her napkin with precise movements, her expression composed as always. But there was a difference now, not visible in her posture, not obvious in her tone, but present in the way she no longer commanded the room without resistance. She had not lost control, not entirely, but she had felt something interrupt it, something she had not anticipated, and that lingered, quietly. She glanced once more toward Emily, who was now refilling a water glass at a nearby table, her movements efficient, unremarkable, exactly as they had been before, and yet, no one in the room could look at her the same way again. One of the guests leaned toward Daniel slightly, his voice low, careful. "Where did you find her?" he asked, the question casual in tone, but edged with interest. Daniel did not answer immediately, his gaze still fixed across the room. "I did not," he said after a moment, his voice calm, almost reflective. She was already here. The distinction mattered, more than the words themselves suggested. The guest nodded slowly, understanding something beneath the surface. Victoria heard the exchange, though she did not react outwardly. She simply reached for her glass again, this time taking a measured sip, her eyes remaining forward, but her thoughts clearly elsewhere. Daniel set his glass down gently, the sound soft against the table. "Do you know what the real issue was?" he said, not directing the question at anyone in particular, but the room listened anyway. "It was not the clause," he continued, his tone even. "It was that no one expected it to be questioned." A quiet agreement settled around the table, not spoken, but understood. One of the men nodded, slower this time, more deliberate, as if acknowledging something. Uncomfortable but necessary. Victoria placed her glass down, her fingers resting lightly against the stem. She turned her head slightly toward Daniel, her expression composed, but her voice quieter than before. "And now it has been," she said, not defensive, not dismissive, just factual. Daniel inclined his head once. "Yes," he replied, and that was all. No further explanation, no elaboration, because none was needed. The moment had already done its work. At the far side of the room, Emily finished clearing a table, aligning the plates with quiet precision before stepping back, her notepad still in her hand, her posture unchanged. She paused briefly near the service station, jotting down a few notes in her small, deliberate script, the same script that had caught Daniel's attention earlier, the same quiet system that had gone unnoticed until now. Another server passed by, offering a small smile, and Emily returned it, subtle, unassuming, as if nothing significant had occurred. And perhaps to her, it had not. Perhaps this was simply how she moved through the world, observing, understanding, speaking only when necessary, and when she did, speaking in a way that could not be ignored. Daniel watched her for a moment longer, then finally leaned back in his chair, the tension in his posture easing, not because the evening had returned to normal, but because he understood now that normal had shifted. And in that shift, something valuable had been revealed, something he had not been looking for, but would not overlook again. And around him, the room continued, quieter, more aware, as if every word spoken from that point forward carried a little more weight than before. The evening did not end with applause. It did not need to. It ended the way most important moments do, quietly, almost unnoticed by anyone who was not paying attention. The last plates were cleared, the final glasses emptied, and, one by one, the guests began to stand, their conversations softer now, their movements more deliberate, as if something in the room had slowed them down. Daniel Whitmore remained seated a moment longer than the others, his hand resting lightly against the table, his gaze drifting once more toward the far side of the room. Emily Carter was finishing her shift, folding her apron neatly, her movements unhurried, precise, as if she treated every small action with the same level of care she had. Given that document, she did not look toward the table again, not because she avoided it, but because she did not need to. She had already said what needed to be said. Victoria Whitmore stood beside her chair, smoothing the fabric of her dress with practiced elegance, her posture flawless as always. But when she turned her head slightly, her eyes found Emily, not with the sharpness from earlier, not with dismissal, but with something quieter, something more thoughtful. She stepped away from the table, her heels soft against the polished floor, closing the distance with controlled grace. The room did not stop, but it noticed. Conversations paused just enough. Glances shifted just slightly. Victoria stopped a few feet from Emily, close enough to be heard without raising her voice. "Miss Carter," she said, her tone measured, not cold, not warm, simply intentional. Emily looked up, meeting her gaze, calm as always. "Yes, ma'am," she replied. Victoria held her eyes for a second longer than expected, as if choosing her words carefully, something she had not needed to do earlier that night. "Earlier," she began, her voice steady. "I spoke without knowing who I was speaking to." A pause followed, not for effect, but for truth. "That was my mistake." The words were simple, but in a room like this, they carried weight far beyond their length. Emily did not react immediately. She did not rush to accept or deflect. She simply listened, the same way she always had, fully, without interruption, and then she gave a small nod. We all read things differently, she said softly, her voice even, her expression unchanged. Some just take longer to understand what they are looking at. Victoria's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, but close, a recognition, perhaps, or an acknowledgement of something she had not expected to learn. Daniel approached then, his presence steady, his steps unhurried. He stopped beside Victoria, but his attention remained on Emily. Tomorrow, he said, his voice calm. 9 o'clock. Emily nodded once. I will be ready, she replied. No hesitation, no uncertainty, just quiet certainty. Daniel inclined his head slightly, not as a gesture of authority, but of respect, and then, without another word, he turned, joining the flow of guests moving toward the exit. Victoria lingered for a second longer, her gaze resting on Emily, as if memorizing something she could not quite name, and then she followed, the sound of her heels fading into the soft hum of the restaurant. Emily stood there for a moment after they left, her notepad still in her hand, her posture unchanged, the room around her returning to its usual rhythm, conversations blending together, lights steady, music low, as if nothing had happened at all, and yet, something had, something quiet, something unseen, something that did not need recognition to exist. She reached for her coat, slipping it on with the same calm precision, and as she walked toward the door, unnoticed by most, she carried nothing with her except what had always been there, a mind that listened, a voice that waited, and a presence that did not need to be loud to be undeniable. And somewhere behind her, in a room that would forget many things by morning, one lesson remained, unspoken but clear, that the people who say the least are often the ones who understand the most, and when they finally speak, the world has no choice but to listen.